Hey everyone, going to be looking now at China's more recent political history. We got into the start of this in class today, looking further back when we were looking at the dynasties and early years of China as a civilization. So now bringing it forward to more recent events, and yeah, I'll get into it. So I did want to go back to where we left off because I kind of had to go through this quickly in class to set the stage for what comes in terms of how China kind of collided with modern developments in other parts of the world, and maybe you could say it was kind of unprepared for it. So, like we noted, there's a few things that people point to, different factors as to why China stagnated. And one of those being cultural, which is that Confucian ideology placed China at the center of the world or universe. So, meaning there's this sense of superiority, and outside knowledge, therefore, would be unimportant, disruptive, unhelpful, right? Because why would we need outside sources? We are the center of the world universe. There's even this term for China as like the middle kingdom, meaning we're like in the middle. This is where life happens, where everyone else should look to us. All right, the second factor there, economic. And with this sort of establishment of meritocracy in terms of how you would achieve rank in society. There's something positive about that, but because had become so entrenched, um, now being an entrepreneur was not really seen as something desirable or a way to achieve success in society. Instead, it's through this process of rising through the ranks of the bureaucratic elite and then pursuing rent seeking, which is the manipulation of policy for personal gain, and also corruption is an aspect of that. And then when you're not sensing that you have this competition around you and no danger at the borders, well, that can kind of make a civilization lethargic and apathetic. And so there we had that quote again, which occurred when King George had sent this trade mission along to see, hey, we have these things that we'd like to trade with you. And the Chinese emperor's response, I set no value on objects strange or ingenious. We have no use for your country's manufactures. Okay, well, you could say maybe the world should have just left China alone, but that isn't what happened. And in any case, what does happen is one major involvement that China gets into is the first Opium War. And this occurs with Great Britain. And it is pretty tragic. In some way, Great Britain kind of forced uh, China to accept the importation of opium. And I suppose Britain's argument at that time was, well, the people wanted this good, this thing, and the government was standing in the way of that happening, the Chinese government. And so the government was maybe in their eyes illegitimate, but as we know, opium as a drug is actually really harmful, and the government of China was actually, I'd say, protecting its people from something that was pretty harmful. Um, as to whether the effects of opium were known to be as harmful as we know them now to be, yeah, I don't know. That's harder to say. But in any case, yeah, a kind of tragic episode. But one thing that does result from this is that China loses Hong Kong. Remember that because we will definitely talk about Hong Kong more later on and how it has dealt with the rest of China. So, and then also you had other powers that wanted similar access to the Chinese trade market. So China wasn't ever really colonized in the same way as some other places where you had like a more imperial claim, but instead you had these different holdings that are found in different areas of China that different people or different other countries lay claim to. Okay, meanwhile, the dynastic system had still been in place in China for centuries and centuries, right? But that is finally eliminated in 1911, the last remnants of what had been the dynasty at the time, the Qing dynasty, Qing, Qing. Okay, out of this, you have these two political organizations arrive, the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party, The Kuomintang we'll just refer to as the KMT from here on out, and the Chinese Communist Party we'll call the CCP. Sometimes you do see it written as CPC, but I think it's more common to say CCP. So, at first, both of these are actually supported by the Soviets. But then, with the death of the KMT's leader, Sun Yat-sen, another member of the KMT, Chiang Kai-shek, seizes control of that party. Relations between those two parties unravel, and then at the time, the KMT is actually the more powerful party, and it expels pro-Soviet and pro-CCP elements from the power center. So the CCP is pushed out of the main power centers, the urban areas, and pushed out to the countryside. Okay. The key leader of the CCP was Mao Zedong, and Mao believed that communist revolution could be led by the peasant class of the countryside. This was something that did kind of put him at odds, actually, with sort of the what was the accepted dogma of communism, which had been thought of as something that had to emerge from urban workers being frustrated with being kind of controlled by the bourgeoisie and exploited by them, and that they were supposed to be the ones to rise up. So Mao said, no, well, I'm a devoted ideological communist, but I think, in fact, this communist revolution can be led by the peasant class. So, while Mao and his followers are on the Long March fleeing KMT attacks, Mao attracted many of the peasant majority to his side. So the Long March, it's not just like a a parade. This is actually as they are being driven away, they're fleeing and start with about 100,000 people, but their numbers really dwindled in terms of the actual members of the CCP, all the way down to about 10% of them. So it had really been set back terribly. But meanwhile, because they're kind of moving along, being driven forward through the countryside, they are able to spread their ideology, their beliefs to those that they encounter, and the peasant people are attracted to Mao's, at least his representation of being supportive of the peasants and supportive of their ability to kind of rise up and take more power in the country. So, and by the way, where I have underlined, you can make special note of those, and also where we see things that are bolded. So, in 1937, Japan invades China, and that was harmful for both parties, both the CCP and the KMT, but it weakened the KMT more. The two parties had sort of come together in an alliance against Japan, but it was loose. They didn't truly get along real well, and then in the meantime, the CCP was able to forge a strong communist military, which is called the People's Liberation Army. That army then drives out the KMT. What happens next? Well, the KMT flees to Taiwan and says, well, we're still the legitimate rulers, the legitimate leaders. So Taiwan did not declare independence at this moment in time. Instead, the KMT declared that they were the legitimate power, the legitimate governors or government over all of China, both Taiwan and what we call mainland China. So, and they were recognized as that, as the legitimate government by the U.S. until 1979. So, because of the way this all transpired, and the Taiwan didn't declare independence, I think today they would consider themselves independent and would be more than happy to just be considered independent at this point. But PRC, which is the People's Republic of China, that's the official long form name of China, has never recognized Taiwan's legitimacy. So, as you can imagine, that is an ongoing source of tension internationally in terms of Taiwan's status and how China deals with Taiwan. There's always the concern that an actual war would break out between China and Taiwan, and then that would, of course, involve other parties like the U.S. needing to defend Taiwan and on and on. So, meanwhile, the CCP it has now set up itself as the official government of China, and that remains the fact up until today. So that said, you see sort of different approaches since the time that they took power in terms of how they exert it. And at first wanted to be real ideological purists of like, we're just going to kind of control everything and control how people think. Um, but given the example of what had happened in the USSR under Nikita Khrushchev, so what happened there is that Stalin had been this very strict, harsh, brutal ruler. And when he died and Khrushchev took over, Khrushchev had been critical of Stalin, said we want to open some things up in the society, allow people to have more of a voice of what they want. So Mao did something similar in China, which is called the 100 Flowers Campaign. But it was kind of sort of empty promises because it doesn't last. And many of the people who took him up on this said, oh, great, you're allowing us the opportunity to criticize the government, were removed from their positions of authority. So it was sort of a false promise, right? Um, and the policy initiative that Mao is most known for, so you definitely want to make note of this, is the Great Leap Forward. So this, although it has some similarities to sort of what you might call like mainstream communist dogmas, it is a major break from the Soviet model. And the reason is Mao organized the Chinese people into a series of communes, and they set so bump something there. Anyway, they had more autonomy, independence to kind of set policies within their communes rather than this being handed down directly from the central government, the national government. So this idea of empowering the people, still within the strong guidelines of the national government, but given a degree of independence. And I'll definitely have more to say about that later on. But in any case, it's still controlled ultimately by the guy at the top, by Mao. And like you see Aladdin saying there, he gave you your power and he can take it away. So the power is still in the hands ultimately of Mao, but he is trying to supposedly open things up to others. Okay, some major failures of the Great Leap Forward and then Mao's response. So rather than creating large foundries, the populace established 1 million backyard furnaces that produced worthless metal. The goal being like, hey, we're going to increase our production of things like steel, but it's done in a way that's it's actually not usable. Economic and agricultural production decline. You have disorder, famine, and tens of millions of deaths. Granted, China has hundreds of millions of people, so pretty much any major event that's going to happen in China is going to involve a lot of people, but still a pretty awful situation. And because of disagreements with the Soviets withdrew their technical expertise they had in terms of like how to go about farming and doing other sorts of things in terms of running a government. So even though things are not going well, rather than say, you know what, this just hasn't worked, Mao's conclusion instead is that the CCC policies had not been radical enough. So he publishes a book called The Quotations of Chairman Mao Zedong, and you will sometimes see his name spelled that way. And that book is nicknamed the Little Red Book. You guys saw copies of it in the documentary that we saw, and it creates this cult of personality around Mao. Okay, so with Mao's accusations that the CCP itself had, quote, taken the capitalist road, Mao encourages student radicals, the Red Guards, to bring about now the Cultural Revolution by attacking authority figures. That includes party leaders and state leaders, intellectuals, teachers, and yes, even their parents. So, Mao is now definitely like a demagogue to be worshipped and revered. Okay, finally, after Mao, things do go a bit of a different direction. So you have a guy named Deng Xiaoping take power after Mao's death in 1976, and Deng de-emphasizes ideology. So he has this quote, whether a cat is black or white makes no difference, as long as it catches mice, it is a good cat. Essentially meaning, I'm not really so much, I don't have to be an ideological purist, just if something works, it works, and that's good enough for me. But still, Politically, the CCP maintains complete control over political life, and by the 1980s, serious problems including inflation, unemployment, widespread corruption, particularly within the CCP.